This Constitution is said to have beautiful features, but when I come to examine these features, they appear to me horribly frightful. Among other deformities, it has an awful squinting. It squints towards monarchy. And does not this raise indignation in the breast of every American? Your president may easily become king. Your Senate is so imperfectly constructed that your dearest rights may be sacrificed by what may be a small minority, and a very small minority may continue forever unchangeably this government, although horribly defective. Where are your checks in this government? Speech of Patrick Henry before the Virginia Ratifying Convention, June 5th, 1788. One of the greatest and most dangerous myths that we're all taught to believe is the myth that is the United States Constitution. We are taught the U.S. Constitution as if the U.S. Constitution is the greatest political constitution ever created, as if there is nothing negative to be said about it. We are taught that the U.S. Constitution is a better constitution than our country's original constitution. We are taught that it establishes a government by the people, for the people. We are taught that it has a system of checks and balances that keeps the government from becoming tyrannical. And most importantly, and probably most obviously, we are taught that the US Constitution is our legitimate government, that it establishes a legitimate central government that we call the federal government. In this video series, I'm going to be providing a series of arguments that will prove without a shadow of a doubt that everything that we have been led to believe about the US Constitution is a lie. Many of the arguments in this video series will not be my own arguments. They will be the arguments from our founding fathers who were opposed to the ratifying of the Constitution. These founding fathers are known as the Anti-Federalist. The video series is going to be made up of multiple sections, and each section is going to be made up of multiple parts. And at the start of the video series, you're probably going to disagree with me, maybe even think that I'm crazy, but I promise you that by the end of this video series, you're going to realize that the US Constitution is a monstrosity, and something that all free people should be concerned about. The first section of this video series will be about the basic legitimacy of the US Constitution, and it will be made up of 7 parts. In this first part, I'm going to be discussing the fact that the US Constitution was drafted in secrecy. Yes, that's right, for those of you who do not know, the US Constitution was drafted and prepared in secret. And for those who will say that this is fake news or false information or just not true whatsoever, here is a screenshot from the constitutioncenter.org website. So here it clearly says, the US Constitution was prepared in secret behind locked doors that were guarded by sentries. Yes, that's right. The federal government hasn't been transparent since day 0. Now, I'm not a lawyer, and I don't know what any of you guys think about this, but to me, this automatically makes the federal government, or at least the actions of these representatives, not legitimate. You cannot be a public figure, you cannot be a public representative, and then carry out your works in secrecy, in private. In another part of this section, I'm going to discuss precisely why they had to carry out their work in secrecy. But for now, I'm going to quote what an Anti-Federalist had to say about this. And this quote comes from the Anti-Federalist paper entitled The Address and Reasons of Dissent of the Minority of the Convention of the State of Pennsylvania to Their Constituents. And it's dated December 18th, 1787. And the quote goes, "The Continental Convention met in the city of Philadelphia at the time appointed. It was composed of some men of excellent character, of others who were more remarkable for their ambition and cunning than their patriotism, and of some who had been opponents to the independence of the United States. The delegates from Pennsylvania were, 6 of them, uniform and decided opponents to the Constitution of this Commonwealth. The convention sat upward of 4 months. The doors were kept shut, and the members brought under the most solemn engagements of secrecy." There's a footnote here, and it says, "The journals of the conclave are still concealed." Okay, I'm not sure if that still applies to today, but this is a relatively recent book, so these journals may still be kept in secrecy. "Some of those who opposed their going so far beyond their powers retired, hopeless, from the convention. Others had the firmness to refuse signing the plan altogether, and many who did sign it did not as a system they wholly approved, but as the best that could be then obtained.
Ha! That sounds a lot like our presidential elections.
And notwithstanding the time spent on this subject, it is agreed on all hands to be a work of haste and accommodation. While the gilded chains were forging in the secret conclave, the meaner instruments of despotism without were busily employed in alarming the fears of the people with dangers which did not exist, and exciting their hopes of greater advantages from the expected plan than even the best governments on earth could produce. The proposed plan had not many hours issued forth from the womb of suspicious secrecy, until such as were prepared for the purpose were carrying about petitions for people to sign, signifying their approbation of the system, and requesting the legislature to call a convention.
So not only has our government never been transparent, but it seems like they've also always been working hand in hand with the media. And did you hear what he said about the fact that there were some people at this convention who were against the independence of the United States? Jesus, it's really like nothing has changed. I'm not going to say anything else, and I'm not going to go into this media and government conspiracy, because that's a topic for another part in this section. Instead, what I'm going to talk about is the consequences of the US Constitution being drafted in secrecy. And the consequences are such. In the secret meeting, there was supposed to be deliberation. They were supposed to be debating the pros and cons of this Constitution. But the cons of this Constitution never got out. Instead, the only thing that got out were the pros. Then, after 4 months of secrecy, and probably 3 months of pure propaganda, when the secret meeting finally ended and their Constitution was completed, they then rushed to have the Constitution passed. And this is what another Anti-Federalist had to say about this, and this quote can be found in Anti-Federalist paper 85, concluding remarks. He says, "While it was agitated, the debates of the convention were kept an impenetrable secret, and no opportunity was given for well-informed men to offer their sentiments upon the subject. The system was therefore never publicly discussed, nor indeed could be, because it was not known to the people until after it was proposed." It must be recollected that when this plan was first announced to the public, its supporters cried it up as the most perfect production of human wisdom. It was represented as either having no defects, or, if it had, they were so trifling and inconsiderable that they served only, as the shades in a fine picture, to set off the piece to the greater advantage. One gentleman in Philadelphia went so far in the ardor of his enthusiasm in its favor as to pronounce that the men who formed it were as under the guidance of divine revelation as was Moses, the Jewish lawgiver. Their language is now changed. The question has been discussed, the objections to the plan ably stated, and they are admitted to be unanswerable. The same men who held it almost perfect now admit it is very imperfect, that it is necessary it should be amended. The only question between us is simply this: shall we accede to a bad constitution under the uncertain prospects of getting it amended after we have received it, or shall we amend it before we adopt it? Common sense will point out which is the most rational, which is the most secure line of conduct. But it is contended, adopt it first and then amend it. I ask, why not amend and then adopt? Most certainly the latter mode of proceeding is more consistent with our ideas of prudence in the ordinary concerns of life. If men were about entering into a contract respecting their private concerns, it would be highly absurd in them to sign and seal an instrument containing stipulations which are contrary to their interest and wishes, under the expectation that the parties, after its execution, would agree to make alterations agreeable to their desire. They would insist upon the exceptionable clause being altered before they would ratify the contract. And is a compact for the government of ourselves and our posterity of less moment than contract between individuals? Certainly not. So here, this Anti-Federalist talks about the fact that the Constitution was signed in secrecy. This Anti-Federalist also talks about the propaganda that was surrounding the US Constitution, even propaganda that went as far as to claim that the US Constitution was of some sort of divine origin. But here the Anti-Federalist opens our eyes to something else. something we should already be familiar with if we know anything about the 10 Amendments, and that is that some individuals managed to end the fake news delusion of this Constitution being a perfect Constitution. However, even after making the most die-hard supporters of the Constitution realize that the Constitution had flaws, they were told, the Anti-Federalists were told, that you should pass the Constitution and then amend it afterwards. And if that sounds familiar to you, you're probably thinking about this.
But we have to pass the bill so that you can find out what is in it away from the fog of the controversy.
Yes, that's right. The sophist in power of today are not so different from the sophist in power of yesterday. Because the two Anti-Federalists that I quoted here were adamant about the US Constitution being amended, and because the US Constitution was eventually amended, I feel it necessary to conclude this part by saying a little something about the Bill of Rights, about the first 10 amendments. And here is what I'm going to say about the first 10 amendments. The first 10 amendments would have never been added if it weren't for the Anti-Federalist, if it weren't for these men complaining about the fact that the Constitution was not as good as people were making it out to be. The second thing I'm going to say is that the first 10 amendments that were added to the Constitution by the sophists are nothing. They are a small shadow of the 10 amendments that were originally proposed by the Anti-Federalist. And not only are the first 10 amendments a small shadow of the original amendments that were proposed, but the way that the 10 amendments, the way that the Bill of Rights was amended to the Constitution, actually made it have less authority than the main body of the Constitution. See, the Anti-Federalists, they didn't just want a Bill of Rights. That was one thing that they wanted. They wanted the actual body of the Constitution amended. But instead, what they got was the sophistry that is the Bill of Rights. But I'll conclude the video here because the Bill of Rights will be talked about more in the third section of this video series. It is vain, sir, to extenuate the matter. Gentlemen may cry, peace, peace, but there is no peace. The war's actually begun. Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here idle? What is it that gentlemen wish? What would they have? Is life so dear, or peace so sweet, as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death.